I want to tell you a story about the Gabriola Commons, what it is, how we grew it, and why it matters beyond our little island. And in doing this, I also want to think about a question, the question of community. How can we live together well? A few years ago, a dear friend of mine, Jay Massell, was coming to the end of his life. Jay always had lived quite frugally, and so he decided to use his legacy to set up the Amazing Grace Ecological Society, AGES for short, whose purpose is to assist in the great transformation which is necessary in our time. After he died, the directors of AGES, of whom I'm one, decided to take a leap of faith. We decided to purchase the goat farm. This beautiful small farm down near the village has a house and several outbuildings and good water and about 26 acres of land. So it's a perfect place to do gardening and farming and to house community organizations and community events. AGES, that's AGES, or at least part of AGES, didn't have the money to buy it outright, but we had enough to put a sizable down payment and to guarantee the mortgage for about 3 years. And we were trusting the community to seize this opportunity and make it work. And they certainly did. The whole process of growing the commons has been completely community-driven. So we held a series of public meetings like this one, and we promised that whatever the community decided would be the basis of the plans for the farm. What came out of this process was a strong consensus that what we wanted was a community commons. So what is a commons? A commons, well, we're used to thinking of the economy as being divided in two sectors, the state and the market. And we often have political arguments about which one should predominate. The commons, according to Peter Barnes, is a third sector. And here are some of his ideas about it. He says the commons is invisible, but it's everywhere. That the commons is what we inherit and must pass on to others. And the commons, it's pretty much anything which we all own or which nobody owns. So a community commons, which it belongs to the common sector, is a place or an asset which is held and managed by a community. And we've learned a lot about managing a community commons. And one of our early sources of information was Elinor Ostrom. Nobody had heard of her at the time, but she went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics for her work. And we used her design principles for the governance of the commons to help us set up a space where we could set our own agenda. Well, how do you do that? You set the agenda by making a space, and to make a space, we kind of had to elbow out the state and the market. They tend to take up all the space. So to deal with the state, we have several regulations that we needed to meet. The first was that we needed permission to do non-agricultural activities on land that's in the agricultural land reserve. In order to get that approval, we had to demonstrate that we were in fact doing agriculture. And we have been doing a lot of agriculture. The second thing we needed was a land use bylaw amendment. And the commons is not a residence or a business or even a normal kind of an institution, so we needed a brand new category. And our local land use planning authority hammered out a wonderful statement of the Gabriola Commons Comprehensive Development Zone, which allows us to be who we are, and with our collaboration, and that turns out, as far as we know, to be pretty much unique in Canada. And then the third thing that we needed was a body to hold title to the land. And that was quite a huge challenge because we were trying to find an organization which both met all of the necessary provincial and federal laws, but which was truly under the control of the community. So we spent thousands of hours in a circle discussing, or many circles, and in the end we feel like we have succeeded and that the foundation covers that off. So we've basically kind of dealt with the state. And then there's the market. We didn't want economic forces to ever have the chance to undermine our commons. So naturally that means we have to pay for it. And I think one of the most amazing things about the commons is the fact that this island had such a commitment to the vision of the commons that most of our mortgage is actually being paid by small-scale monthly donors, just paying a few dollars each. And along with several large anonymous donations, this has brought the mortgage down to a point where we feel secure that the market isn't going to swamp the commons. So this gives us the chance to think about the commons itself. How are we going to manage and sustain our commons? The land and its resources, and the people and their relationships to the land and to each other. That's really the question I started with. How can we live together well? And this is not just a local question, because I think our commons is essentially an intentional experiment in future building. As a group of people who now have the freedom and security to decide how we're going to live with the land and with each other, we are a living laboratory for how to answer this question that Robert Theobald raised: how to achieve the inevitable, impossible transformation. One of the ways that we are doing this is to follow one of the core values we had from the beginning, which is to share power. We have abdicated all forms of coercion or domination as far as we possibly can. So we had to come up with a shared power structure. This one is, as it says at the top, a work in progress, and this is a somewhat older version, but what we have are teams who take care of each of our areas of interest or responsibility, and they all come together in Commons Council, where the team representatives and anybody who wants to come can get together and discuss matters of mutual concern. We've found this to be a really interesting process and one that we're getting better at over time. So we've learned some lessons from the Commons. Of course, we've learned a whole lot of practical, on-the-ground sorts of lessons: how to grow food, how to take care of the land, how to manage projects, how to run events, organizing, communicating, fundraising, you name it. This is some ideas that came from one of our kids about what goes into community. I really love this. But what I'd like to talk about as far as lessons learned from the Commons today are the lessons learned about sharing power, about using power with instead of power over. Here's a first insight, is that consensual decision-making doesn't begin in, or necessarily even end in, total agreement. In fact, one of the things it requires is a willingness to disagree, so that you can hear and include all of the voices. Another thing we've learned is that, yes, trust is necessary, but trust is possible. People have motivation for good. And you can find that motivation and you can hook into it, and together you can move forward. My experience at the Commons has taught me that this is not only possible, it's actually quite reliable. A third lesson is that power with requires skills. Fortunately, these are learnable skills. We've all gotten better at becoming part of teams, part of council. And in these and in other settings, one of the things we found is really necessary is skills of compassionate communication, what Marshall Rosenberg calls nonviolent communication. This is a practice which assumes that we are all compassionate by nature and that coercive and dominating behaviors are essentially learned. In fact, they're taught and promoted by the prevailing culture. We're trying to build a new culture, so we need new skills. And these folks are using those skills to decide the passionately difficult question of which trees are going to be cut down and which trees are going to be preserved. And finally, underneath all of these things, there is an essential underlying attitude that I think we've been talking about today already. An attitude which is strengthened by talking honestly with each other and by working together, as one of our members said, knee to knee in the dirt. It's an attitude of appreciative respect, of relatedness in common humanity. It's an attitude which believes that the other has something to say which is worth hearing, that the other has the right to make their own choices without coercion, that the other has value. So how have some of these lessons that we've learned apply to the great transformation which is needed for global survival? Well, one lesson that any self-organizing community might take some note of is that power with does require protection from power over. This is one of the things that Elinor Ostrom taught us in one of her design principles. Essentially, you do need that elbow room where the choices that your community makes are not going to be overridden by some outside force. Another lesson, which I think is quite universal, is that power with is really slow. Just finding out what it is you disagree about, figuring out how you're going to handle that disagreement, talking to everybody, bringing all the voices in, figuring out what you're going to do, moving forward together. It can be excruciatingly slow at times. Or at least, making decisions under power with can be very slow. But implementing them, you can really pick up speed. Because decisions that are made by power over often slow down a lot when it comes to implementing them because of all the resistance that they would receive. If you weren't part of making the decision, you're not necessarily going to carry it out. But when we make a decision with shared power, you can just go ahead and do things. And the speed with which we have brought this land into fruit and flower just continues to astonish me. I learned an old African proverb recently. It goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you.